The Fire Emblem franchise has always been a mysterious beast to Western gaming markets. Many gamers in the United States didn't even hear about the series until two of its characters, Marth and Roy, found their way into the Super Smash Bros. Series due to popularity in Japan. Following a spike in Western interest, the first title we received in the United States was Fire Emblem The Blazing Blade, or, as it was localized for us, just Fire Emblem. A Game Boy Advance title that was actually the prequel to a story we never got to experience. Even after that, the next entry, Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones, was a hurried release which used the majority of the same assets from The Blazing Blade, feeling like a bit more of the same, but with some different characters and mechanics. Then, we finally received our first Fire Emblem game on a home console with the release of Fire Emblem Path of Radiance on the Nintendo GameCube. This difficult turn-based strategy game drastically increased affection for the series in Western markets, despite its brutal degree of challenge, as Americans finally got to see what all the fuss was about. Being the first GameCube entry in the Fire Emblem franchise, and the first console entry from the series in the US, Path of Radiance had a lot more impressive hardware to work with than its many releases on the Super Nintendo in Japan or the Game Boy Advance in the US. Utilizing the power of the GameCube, as well as being able to construct a bigger game, meant that Intelligent Systems, Fire Emblem's developers, could make a lot of changes, additions, and improvements to the way a Fire Emblem game plays. Many of these changes have persisted through the franchise's most recent entries, and while there are far too many little changes that could be discussed, from keys having multiple uses to the new biorhythm feature that affects your character's performance based on how they're feeling, we're just going to focus on the bigger changes that really made this game stand out, not just among Fire Emblem titles, but as a freestanding strategy game as well. And hopefully, as we delve through all of this, we may discover what's so great about Fire Emblem Path of Radiance. For those who may be unfamiliar with Fire Emblem, it's a Nintendo-produced series of tactical role-playing games in which the player usually takes on the role of an unnamed tactician or some high-class leader of an army as they experience all forms of wars, civil uprisings, or semi-apocalyptic events. The majority of the series' releases are standalone titles, following the same general themes and mechanics, but with very few, if any, continuous story elements between titles. Fire Emblem Path of Radiance, however, is actually one of the few that are part of a continuity, being the first half of the Radiance saga, the second half being Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn on the Nintendo Wii. Following the main character, Ike, and his comrades known as the Grail Mercenaries, players will unravel the fate of the war-torn continent of Tellius during the height of a war involving the humanoid Beork and the animal shape-shifting Laguz. Unlike the majority of protagonists in Fire Emblem games, Ike is a mercenary, not a lord or prince. This difference allows for a much greater opportunity for character growth between the many units you control among your ranks. It isn't as much of a tunnel vision focus on your lords or main characters. Keeping so many of your characters on the same playing field in terms of their social hierarchy means there's more opportunities for any character to be deemed important or at least interesting to a player. In many Fire Emblem games, it feels as though there have typically been 2 or 3 main characters, usually nobles of some kind, a few close friends who helped push the majority of the story along, and then a bunch of pawns and soldiers you've collected along the way. Sure, many of these minor characters still have backstories, or maybe even some interesting development, but there was still an easily discernible separation between these categories of characters. Some felt like protagonists, while others just felt like meat for the grinder. Now, with the main party being a band of mercenaries instead of princes and lords, there's more common ground for relationships between all kinds of characters to develop, especially with the beefed up support options and interstitial dialogue for each chapter. The Fire Emblem series is known for being a pretty hardcore strategy franchise, with permadeath looming over any characters who may fall in battle. Luckily, Path of Radiance has an excellent learning curve to slowly introduce the player to all of the mechanics they'll need in order to succeed. The combat tutorial at the very beginning is paced so that if you follow the expected steps, you'll level up at the end of your training fight with Grail, allowing you to see the process of leveling and gaining stats. As long as you aren't playing on the highest difficulty, there will also be plenty of rewatchable tutorials whenever you need a refresher, but the majority of this game's rules are luckily taught through hands-on experience rather than reading and rote memorization. On Ike's first mission as a fledgling merc, you have one of each type of melee weapon at your disposal. Ike has a sword, Boyd has an axe, and Oscar has a lance. Utilizing these 3 character specialties, the player can experience the pros and cons of the combat triangle, a staple of the Fire Emblem franchise, with each type of weapon being more powerful than another in a rock, paper, scissors layout. During your second mission, as the younger units charge into battle, you're now faced with a greater number of enemy units and the lack of your promoted paladin unit, Titania. However, you're now joined by the staff wielder Reese, who can heal units who find themselves in dire straits. You'll also come across the first of many tiles in the environment that affects your character's stats in combat. That would be the heal hedges that sparsely populate some of the world's greener environments and heal any unit who ends a turn on that tile. It's a minuscule amount of health compared to what a healing unit like Reese could offer, but sometimes you have to take what you can get. And the extra avoidance boost of hiding in foliage is an added bonus for any unit on the defensive. In the third chapter, you'll still have a small band of units, but this time you'll get to mix things up with a heavy knight and a sniper for practice with other unit types. Beyond this, the game will slowly sprinkle in other weapon specialists, magic users, mounted soldiers, and a whole array of weapon and stat combinations that keep combat interesting. It feels as though we're being introduced to all the different class types at a much slower pace than many other strategy games out there, even other Fire Emblem games. That's good in the sense of becoming more familiar with the characters and classes you do have under your command, but it also challenges players to start thinking about their tactics in combat. The holes left in your strategies from a lack of other units provide several new challenges. One huge change to the gameplay experience introduced in Path of Radiance would be the fact that this is the first Fire Emblem game to include a base at which you can spend time preparing your units physically and socially for their next chapter. There's a lot that could overwhelm fledgling players upon discovering this home base, but just as Ike is new to being a commander and all of the responsibilities that come with the position, the player is newly introduced to all of the added features of this Fire Emblem entry, and needs to learn how to best utilize the information and resources at hand to lead their army to victory. This space is where you can change soldiers' equipment, store or purchase additional items for later, and listen to optional dialogue from the game's main characters. These conversations are often just for fun, but can sometimes offer the player new equipment, insight into an upcoming challenge, or even a new unit on rare occasions. Even outside of the tangible benefits of observing these conversations, these scenes are an excellent way to broaden the game's lore and each character's story, without forcing players to sit through cutscenes in between each level. Instead, you can read at your own pace to take it all in, just select the higher priority options in case of benefits, or skip these dialogues entirely. Some of these conversations will actually require input from the character that could change minor aspects of the game, at least on the surface. For instance, before making a decision such as hiring a lockpick, you could consult with your advisors for their opinion on the matter. Having to choose whether or not a unit joins you aids in creating the sense that you never know if someone is a friend or foe, and whether they should be trusted among your ranks. When a game just hands you a new ally, your immediate reaction would be something along the lines of believing whatever they're presented as. If they wound up betraying you later down the line, then you would just have this apathetic sense that whatever happened was inevitable. If they never joined you in the first place, then you may wish you had their skills later on. However, knowing that a negative situation could have just been avoided had you made the right decision makes these choices actually matter. This sensation is compounded by the fact that even if you're a returning Fire Emblem player, this feature was newly introduced in Path of Radiance, so there's still some room for uncertainty even in those familiar with the majority of character archetypes and typical story development within the franchise. Back at your team's base, you can also add bonus experience to your units to level them up between chapters. The extra experience points for you to spend are gathered according to how well you perform in each mission, as well as whether or not you completed optional objectives that can only be gathered through close attention to introductory dialogue before each stage. This bonus leveling feature adds a lot more potential for your underleveled units, who in previous entries would often fall by the wayside after a few chapters of being uninvolved in your party's affairs. In Path of Radiance, if you have to replace a fallen unit for instance, you have a better chance at having a suitable replacement at hand thanks to a stockpile of extra experience points. This also makes a big difference for your already promoted units who gain experience much more slowly from battle. There are now skills that can be assigned and removed from each character, giving them special abilities that give them the upper hand in the field. These skills existed in very rare circumstances in earlier Fire Emblem titles, but were usually class or character specific, and couldn't even be affected or often noticed by the player. Some units start with skills of their own, like Mia the Myrmidon having the Vantage skill that gives her the chance to strike first. You may notice this happening in your first interactions with her in the previous chapter, and it's such a noticeable difference in how she handles combat that it makes you wonder what's going on in her stats to make something like that possible. You may also have seen Soren attacking twice in a row with his Adept skill. Different skills take up different amounts of capacity for each character, allowing units to either go all in on a single powerful ability, or spread out their points among skills with more minor benefits. The player is free to experiment with these skills as they collect more characters or even learnable skills as items throughout the game. The support system between comrades has also undergone drastic changes in between releases. In Fire Emblem on Game Boy Advance, I hardly even understood that the feature existed, only stumbling across 2 conversations in my entire playthrough if memory serves correctly. In the Sacred Stones, I made a little bit more of an attempt to have my units spend time near each other, but if they gained the opportunity for a support conversation in the middle of a heated battle, then you had to waste a turn for them to talk to each other. Now you can use the gained level of trust between 2 units to have a conversation at your base between stages in order to boost their support level for the following chapters. Another great change that Path of Radiance introduced to the Fire Emblem franchise would be a very broad expansion in regards to all of the level designs, objectives, and victory conditions. Defensive missions are no longer always about staying alive for a certain number of turns. Now there may be an actual position on the map that you must keep the enemy from reaching. There are also new types of objectives, such as the new escape victories. These missions require Ike to reach a certain spot on the field in order to flee the battle and bring the conflict to a close. You can also allow your other units to escape earlier than Ike for their own safety, but the benefits of doing this are left vague by the game's tutorial. There's a long stretch of the game once you're really up and running that's technically considered to be one chapter, yet consists of multiple stages, during which you can't access your supply or stores, nor can you change units. The most you can do between each stage is call in a couple more allies as reinforcements. You're warned about the difficulty of this mission through optional dialogue beforehand, as many pieces of dialogue give you indirect advice about upcoming missions, but the real difficulty here is strategizing wave after wave of units without an option to really take inventory or plan very far in advance. You've almost certainly brought all of your strongest and most valuable units along on this mission since Stage 1, but the longer things go on and the more grunts you have to fend off, the lower your supplies will run and the more complicated maneuvers you'll have to pull off. This is a great way to change the approach of the player's role as tactician from how do we take out these really powerful units to simply how do we all make it through this in one piece. Speaking briefly on a later mission in the game without giving anything away, I really like the mission known as Solo, where the enemies are using human shields. It's a much more involved level than the typical Horde mode stage that would usually test a player's ability to outthink their opponents. And this stage does bring the choice on how to proceed entirely down to the player. If you couldn't care less, then these unarmed priests are nothing more than destructible walls between you and your targets. But if you're along for the ride, following the character development within the story, then you may be more adverse to that gameplay and opt for a more puzzle-style approach to working your way around the innocent hostages. This also means you can't have some of the more powerful abilities like Tanith's Reinforce at your disposal. Unless you're looking for chaos, it wouldn't be wise to call in partner units who will indiscriminately attack anything on the red side. Speaking once more briefly on the added capabilities that the GameCube's hardware provided over the Game Boy Advance or Super Famicom, this was the first entry to feature both 3D animations and models, as well as voice acting and fully rendered cinematics. The finer graphical details and the use of 3D models allows for much more interesting or even understandable cutscenes and use of space, even in the broad scale of the game's world. Characters can actually stand around each other between fights as they discuss the events of the coming chapter. They aren't beholden to a single sprite square as they were in previous entries. There are also much more interesting ways that the environment has been structured, as displayed with the inclusion of a pirate ship in the 4th mission. In the Game Boy Advance games, that would likely have taken up the stage's entire screen. The combat animations also have a much more satisfying sense of weight to them than the pixelated predecessors. You can really feel the tension in the way a knight walks or how an axe is swung. Consecutive attack animations actually flow together much more smoothly as well. The distinct differences in size, speed, and equipment for various units creates a dynamic battlefield where each successful hit is worthy of rejoice, and each blow from the opposing side is sure to build pressure. Aside from the individual character animations, there are a lot of different settings for the close-up views of your fights. It isn't just based on the general environment, such as a forest or city, but often includes details down to the map location and surrounding decor of that unit. This makes every stage of the game much more memorable and flat out more enjoyable to experience. Fire Emblem Path of Radiance was finally a chance for American and European audiences to really be impressed by a series they had been missing out on for years. Not only that, but the massive jump in hardware capabilities between Fire Emblem releases allowed this title to really stand out from its predecessors as a strategy game worthy of players' time and emotional investment. The complicated relationships between the Beork and the Luguz races, as well as the finely spun tale of war, loss, and prejudice, holds onto its audience's attention to provide an enjoyable standalone epic, but also generates plenty of intrigue into what follows this game's events, taking place on its direct sequel on the Wii. Basically being a massive, expanded game of chess, the Fire Emblem series is a rare instance where the degree of challenge can vary wildly from game to game and even level to level, as access to different characters, resources, and scenarios fluctuates according to what the story demands. While extraordinarily challenging, these games also follow strict and fair guidelines, requiring a skilled tactician to see the characters safely through to the end. Path of Radiance, being the massive step forward that it was for this series in terms of both technology and sheer thematic scope, lifted the Fire Emblem franchise into critical praise in Western markets during the twilight era of the GameCube's popularity, reminding Nintendo that this series deserved to be experienced around the world by anyone looking for an interesting, challenging, and fun strategy adventure. That is what's so great about Fire Emblem Path of Radiance. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we explored Fire Emblem Path of Radiance. Want to see some bonus content? Maybe support the creation of these videos? If so, check out the What's So Great Discord, Twitch, or Patreon. Links for all of those are in the description. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, Kirby's Adventure, on screen or in the description. And please take the time to subscribe to be involved in the discussions here. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.